You, if you could, turn with me to Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. We're going to be there in just a moment. We're in the midst of this. You can flip the slide to the next, please. Thank you. We're in the midst of this sermon series called Summer Tunes, and we're looking at different songs and what they mean. And so at the end of this sermon, you'll hear another song. I'm not going to give that up quite yet. But we're looking at different things. And today I wanted to look at this popular story in chapter 15 of Luke. Because what it does is it elevates the heart of the Father. So many times when we come to this story, and in your bulletin there's a white piece of paper that has like blanks and those kind of things on it. And this is what it looks like. It's a sermon outline for this morning if you want to fill it in. So many times when we come to this story, we look at the younger son and the older son, and we study them and their reaction. And we're going to do a little bit of that because we have to do that in order to see the Father's heart. But today, I want to focus on the Father's heart. I want to look at what the Father does in reaction to his younger son and his older son in this story. So maybe this is a different look. I hope you'll stay with me this morning. In the New Testament, we see the, quote, religious leaders of the day complaining. In fact, in this passage, if you read the first couple of verses of Luke chapter 15, you're going to see that. They're going to be complaining about Jesus sitting and eating and ministering to sinners because people then had a wrong perspective of God. They did not see his heart, and they certainly mismeasured it. I find the same today. People who have a wrong perspective about God, the heart of the Father, specifically when it comes to his heart in his house, the church. In Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells a parable about the Father's heart. And long and behold, it happens in the Father's house. It's two sons in his house. You are very familiar with the story, I'm sure, but let me remind you with the Pastor Brett notes of the story. This is not the scriptures, but it is built off the scriptures. So in the parable, the father has two sons. One son asks for the father's inheritance. He then goes out and spends the entire inheritance on wild living. We learn in the scripture passage that wild living is prostitution. It's things that are crazy and not good and not godly. And then he finds himself cashless, no money, trying to figure out where he's going to eat. He even considers eating the pods of the pigs, which if you know anything about farming, pig food is not exactly human food. I mean, it is human food, but doesn't look very good. He gets this grand idea that he'll go back to his father's house and ask to be a servant of his father. So he's not sure what kind of response he will get from the father. He heads back to the house. The father sees him, calls for his servants to kill the fattened calf that has been saved for such a celebration. He gives them a wonderful robe, throws the biggest shindig this town has ever seen, and everyone is happy. Well, almost everyone. Meanwhile, in the field is his father's other son, the older one. He's been faithful working on his father's field for years, and his dad has never once, well, so he says, celebrated him like he did for his younger brother. Even though his younger brother blew his dad's inheritance, so he's out in the field having a pity party for himself. But in reality, who would blame him? Right? I mean, isn't this injustice? I have busted my backside for you, Dad, for years. This boy, who I can't even acknowledge as my brother right now, this son of yours has gone out and blown the entire inheritance his entire inheritance on wild living, and you kill the fattened calf for him. Ridiculous. It's in this story that we hear the heart of the God. The heart of the father in his house dealing with his two very different sons. So here's what we're going to look at this morning. We're going to look at 5 key principles about the heart of the father. It's on the next slide there. And here's the first one next. The heart of the father in his house is one that loves us in spite of us and receives us unreservedly. Listen to this verse in chapter 15 of 20, verse 20. He says, "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him." Wait, this is wrong. This son blew everything. He took the inheritance like it was his own money and just threw it out on wild living, and now he comes back. I mean, how many of us as dads would watch our son take his inheritance, blow it, then try to come back and ask us to come back into our lives? What would be your response? I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be was filled with compassion. Yet the Father is filled with compassion. And this compassion is not a condescending one. This compassion is a loving one. As you can see, there's a huge hug that's given. And in the Greek, the word for compassion literally means fell on his neck. Hung on for dear life. He has compassion for his son. And so what does that have to do with my life in 2023? Great question. I'll answer it for you. Maybe you've blown the inheritance. Maybe you haven't done everything the Father's asked. Maybe today you have found yourself in a place where you're not sure how the Father responds to you. Can I assure you that he loves you in spite of you? And he receives you back, and I mean by that, he hugs you over your neck. Unreservedly. There's not a caution, otherwise the scripture would say so. There's not a he stopped and he thought about tearing into him, but then he grabbed a hold of him and gave him a hug. It is straight out, run and jump on his son who blew it all. And so the first action we see at the heart of the Father is that he loves us in spite of us, and he receives us without reservation, no matter where we stand. Number 2, the heart of the Father in his house is one that celebrates us with more than we expect or deserve. And so as we see in verse 22 through 24, we're going to read that right now. But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine, he was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found." So they began to celebrate. As we see in verses 22 through 24, the father doesn't even really acknowledge the words of his son. What were the words of his son? Let's look at verse 21. It's on the next slide. Here's what it says in verse 21. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against you, against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Now, he had practiced this, much like I did when I was a child. There were times when I know this is going to be hard to believe, and hold on to your seats, but I upset my father, all right? And so I would stand in front of the mirror, literally, and say, practice my look. Dad, I'm really sorry for what I did. Trying to convince him that I was really sorry for what I did, even though maybe in my heart I wasn't as sorry as what I was trying to portray. Now, this son wasn't doing that. This son really was sorry. And he was practicing what he was going to say. And according to verse 21, he doesn't even get through the entire apology. Because what he wants to ask the father is that I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, so can I be your servant? And in verse 22, as you'll see on your sermon outline, he interrupts him. And the father, literally, as his son is apologizing for blowing all of his inheritance and asking him, just give me a servant role. I'll be your servant. I won't be your son anymore. You can take all my rights away. All those things. The father, still with his arm around his neck, calls to his servants and says, hey, go get the fattened calf and kill it. Go bring him a new robe. Go put sandals on his feet. Because, friends at Faith Church, the heart of the Father in his house will celebrate you more than you expect or deserve. When you return, after not doing what you were supposed to do, after blowing the inheritance, he will kill the fattened calf. And he will celebrate you more than you deserve. I want you to notice a few things here because they're very important to the story. The best robe. That's not the former one he left behind. No, this one's reserved for notable guests. See, back in this time and age, they would have had robes so that when guests came from far along, they're walking on dirty paths. They're walking on things that aren't always easy, and they're sweating, and they're all those kind of things. And so when those notable guests showed up in their ugly robes because they were dirty or whatever, they would have a robe for them, clean, beautiful. And this father is taking hold of his son, and he's saying, bring out the best robe. I don't want the second-class one. I don't want the one that's for the guy that's underneath the president. I want the best one for my son. But then he continues and he says, put a ring on his finger. And this ring would bestow his father's authority to the son. And so what the father is saying by putting the ring on the finger is that all those things that you practice, son, that apology that you practiced for me about not being my son any longer and being a servant, well, guess what? I'm going to put a ring on your finger and I'm going to show you that I'm giving you all the authority of being my child back. Sandals. Unlike today, sandals were a luxury of the day. You know who did not wear sandals? Servants. They didn't get sandals. And so the father, in a reaction to that apology that the son's been practicing, puts sandals on him and shows him, no, you're back to my son. You absolutely will not be one of my servants. And then the fattened calf. Unlike today, meat was not usually eaten at mealtime. This calf was fed a special food and kept for a huge celebration. And the father is stirring that huge celebration for his lost but found son. My, oh my, how much God the Father loves us. Every one of these things is not to correspond with some spiritual reality. No, instead it is to show that the heart of the Father is to celebrate with us more than we expect or deserve. The Son did not deserve this. In fact, he deserved to get what was coming to him. Right? I mean, you take this out of the Bible and every last one of you reads this story and you say, that son needs to be sat down and he needs to be told how wrong he was. Right? You read this story in a magazine, you're not going to be so loving and caring. The only reason we're loving and caring when we're reading this story is because it's a Bible story. And so we think there's got to be a different reaction. But if we read this in a magazine, sitting waiting to get our hair done, or lack thereof, whatever we're doing, and we're reading this in a magazine, we're getting furious. He did what? With what? Are you serious? And we're waiting for him to get what's coming to him. And so the story continues and it talks about him going back to his father, and we think he's going to get ripped. And he doesn't. He finds more grace and love than he ever should have. And not only grace and love, but they actually celebrate him. They actually throw a party for him. They actually give him the last thing he deserves. But number 3, the heart of the Father in his house is one that ministers to those who question his heart. And so here it is in 25, we are introduced to the older son. The one, by the way, that we probably most relate to sometimes. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and he asked him what was going on. Well, your brother has come home, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has had him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. The older son is upset with the father's heart and he's questioning it. That's what he's doing. He's saying, wait a second. I've been out here in this field busting. I've been fertilizing. I've been doing all the things that I need to do. This son takes the inheritance that he has and blows it, and now he's getting a party? What about my party? And so knowing now, and I didn't say this before, but the relation here is that this father is God himself with his people. And how many times don't raise your hand, but how many times do we do that? I'll be honest, I just did it this week. You mean to tell me I've been doing this for this long and you're not going to celebrate me? I'm not going to get the highest promotion? And we do this in the church a lot. I've been a faithful member for this long. This person comes in, they get a celebration because they did this, but I've been a faithful member. I haven't got a celebration. But you know what God does? God doesn't stand in the party and let his son out there having a pity party. That's what we would do, right? Freddie's having a pity party, I'm in the party. Hey, let him out there and cry. He's the one with the problem. Let him figure it out. Not this father. No, listen to the passage. Meanwhile, while that son is out in the field, the father went out and pleaded with him. He pleaded with him. We're going to see what that pleading looks like in a minute, but I want you to stop and realize that the Father doesn't let you in your pity party without pleading with you. He doesn't say, your problem, you get over it. He makes it his problem. And he goes out with a loving heart to plead with you to come join the celebration. Now, the other part of this story is that the Pharisees are the one hearing this story for the most part. And so Jesus is making this point about the Father because the Pharisees are the kings of doing pity parties. I've followed every rule from every jot and tittle. And when there wasn't a rule, God, I made up a rule so that there was a rule. So that I could follow you until nth degree. Now this son goes out, breaks what seems to be every rule, because remember, he is now sexually immoral. He has now sold himself to other people. That's what prostitution means, in case you didn't know that. He has now done things that some of us consider disgusting, immoral. All of those things. He has every reason, the older son, to be upset with the father in some ways. But the Pharisees are sitting and watching this, and they're the kings of doing this. You celebrate that blind woman who comes to know you. You celebrate the Samaritan woman who comes to know you. But what about us, the religious leaders of the day? And you know what Jesus' answer to them is? He doesn't even leave them go without an answer. He says, you're like whitewashed tombstones. You look great to the whole outside world, but inside you're dying. You're dying. Because you're missing the point. It's not about following rules. It's about giving me your heart. But here's the plea that the Father gives to the Son. Number 4, the heart of the Father in his house ministers to us even when we see him as scorekeeper. So in verse 19, the son answers the father, and he says, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours has squandered your property and prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. Now, I want to go over something with you that I learned in college. Yes, I still remember some things that I learned in college. When you do a true-false test in college, they taught us this. And maybe it doesn't stand today, but it did in 1998 whenever I learned this. Whenever somebody says always or never in the passage, in the question, this always happens when this happens, it's usually a false statement. Because for something to always happen, that's a pretty good percentage. And so when this son says, and many commentaries pick up on this, when this son says, I've never disobeyed your orders, I'm not so sure. It's like the rich young ruler. What does he say to the rich young ruler? And he says, listen, I followed all those rules till I was, when I was growing up, I followed all those rules, blah, 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 blah. And he says, well, okay, go sell all your goods and then come back to me. And the scripture says the rich young ruler walked away sad because there was a problem in his heart with riches. And so he really didn't follow all the rules. He made riches above God. This boy is doing the same thing. Never disobeyed you once. Okay. And then we go to the next statement. But you never gave me a young goat. Did he? We won't know. But we can be pretty much guaranteed that the father didn't leave him go without a celebration from time to time. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. I need to give you a little backstory because this will show you that the son didn't exactly do what he was supposed to do. In ancient Jewish law and tradition, the elder brother was the mediator in family financial disputes. Go back and read the first half of this passage and find anywhere where the elder brother comes in and helps his father divvy up the inheritance to the younger brother. He doesn't. So no, you didn't follow all the rules. That was your responsibility. Your father should not have been left there with the younger brother to figure all this out. It is your responsibility as the elder brother to come in out of those fields and to deal with this issue. It's Jewish tradition. It's Jewish law. It is what it is. The elder brother should have been in the discussions. We see nothing about the elder brother until all this transpires. Then he pitches a fit. Had he done what he was supposed to do, and had he followed every rule that the father had laid down and every rule that the land had laid down, he wouldn't be in the position he's in now. So no, you haven't followed it perfectly, elder son. You missed a spot. And because you missed that spot, you are now out of the game. The father was left alone to divide up the inheritance. Why wasn't the elder brother present to help bring reconciliation, to talk some sense into his brother? Like Cain, he wasn't being his brother's keeper. He fled from his true and his right family duties. The elder brother didn't step up to the mic and lead like he should have. And now he's pitching a fit. Because I didn't get what I wanted. If you would have stepped up in the first place and done what your family's duties were, you wouldn't be in this situation. You see, the older brother sees his father as the scorekeeper. Got to keep plugging away for him to be faithful to the calls. Keep lugging instead of seeing his father as one who loves him unconditionally and does not keep score. And my, oh my, how we can get sucked into that with God the Father, right? Got to keep lugging away. Better make sure I do this. Better make sure I do that. Better make sure I push a little harder because the Father may not love me as much. He says that comment, son of yours, to get his father's attention. Don't we almost feel for this son? And you want to know why we do? Because unlike the younger son, we relate most to this son. Because we're scorekeepers. Right? We don't like to admit it, but we are. That person does wrong, take his head off. Not that, we don't say that. Or maybe we do. That person does wrong, he's got to pay the price. However, when we do wrong, we want to be treated like the younger son. But when they do wrong, we want them to be treated like their sins deserve. Look, I've done X, Y, and Z faithfully and never once been celebrated, never once been given recognition, we say. Don't forget who's a part of the crowd that day. Again, the Pharisees, who were like, look who Jesus is hanging with. Kind of wondering, why doesn't he hang with us who follow the law to the T? And if there's something missing, we'll make up a law for it. We've also got to be careful of legalism in our lives and taking ourselves too seriously, refusing to laugh at ourselves at times. We get into serious trouble when life is based upon law, merit, and reward. Because God's economy is not based on that. Follow the law, get merit, and get a reward. What God's love is based on is love and graciousness. We elder brothers also struggle with entitlement. Basically, when the younger brother was welcomed back, the older brother thought it's not fair. He's taking even more of my inheritance. And Dad, you have no right to do this, but I have rights here. The elder brother was an injustice collector. Grace wasn't in his vocabulary. This is not a fun place to be. I've been there. This type of existence is a slavish one because it focuses on scorekeeping. More like an imprisoned slave than a beloved son. I gotta do. Because I love God, I gotta do. How about you get to do? Because you're a beloved son or daughter of the Father. How about that? How about it's not you gotta do, it's you get to do. Number 5, the heart of the Father in his house desires to have sweet fellowship with those who have a relationship with him. Here's the words that he says to his father, to his son, his older son, that I think are just so genuine, and we need to hear them loud and clear this morning. My son, the father said, you were always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. I want you to notice what the father says, my son. That must have shattered that older son's heart. Remember what he has now said to his father. This son of yours, he's disconnected himself to the family. And now the father brings it back around and he says, my son, you've always been there with me. Jesus here in the parable is saying to those law keepers standing around, those elder brother type, if you would, hey, there's still a chance for heart change. You've always been here. You've always done what you've been asked to do as much as you could. Again, maybe always isn't the best word. We had to celebrate in the original language gives indication that there was a divine calling for celebration. In other words, what it's saying in the original language in the Greek in Luke 15, when Jesus says we had to celebrate, why did he have to celebrate? He didn't have to celebrate, did he? Oh, yes, he did, because the heavens were roaring that the son came home. And Jesus looks at the other son and he goes, listen, I had no choice but to celebrate because the Father in heaven was calling for a celebration. That's the literal words there. When it says you had to, we had to celebrate. In the Greek, it means that the heavens were already rumbling. The angels were rejoicing. Remember what it says earlier in Luke 15, that only one coming back will bring a celebration in heaven. If one is found out of the 99 and brought back, it'll bring a celebration in heaven. And so Jesus is saying to the Son here, listen, you're always with me. You want to know what your celebration is? You have everything that I have. You're my son. You're my daughter. You can use that to do ministry. But we had to celebrate. Because this other son of mine, he decided to go out and do something dumb. There's no other way to put it. But then he had a heart change. And he came back and he was just begging to be even a servant in the family. And me being the father that I am, me being the perfect father, I cannot look at him and say, forget you. I must run to him. And I must celebrate him because all of heaven celebrates him. And do you know what? All of heaven celebrates you too. He's not a scorekeeper. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, love does not keep records of wrongs. If love doesn't do that, then why would God, who's perfect love? Friends, I want you to understand the heart of the Father because I frankly think too many American Christians, me included, do not understand the heart of the Father. Now, there's reasons for that. One, we grew up with a father who is not like the Father. That is a perfectly legit reason. We don't understand a father who looks at us and says, listen, it's not about what you do, it's about heart change. We don't get that. But the other reason is because we like to mold God the Father into our own thinking. And so when we read a story like this, we say, what a ripoff. Because I'm about justice. That boy should have got what he had coming, and that older brother had every right to stand in that field and pitch a fit. Because he's a scorekeeper to you. Because you've molded him like you. Timothy Keller used to say, if God never disagrees with you, then you've made him an idol. He is no longer God. If he never disagrees with your thoughts, if you're always right and he's always just a tad bit off. Careful with the Father's heart. Charles Spurgeon, the great preacher, said it this way, the truth here taught is just this, that mercy stretches forth her hand to misery, that grace receives men as sinners, that it deals with shortcoming, unworthiness, and worthlessness, that those who think themselves righteous are not the objects of divine compassion, but the unrighteous are. See, Jesus didn't come to heal the healthy. The healthy don't need a doctor. The sick do. The guilty and the undeserving are the proper subjects for the infinite mercy of God. In a word, that salvation is not of merit, but of grace. He didn't offer you what he did on the cross because you're good enough. Because you're not. I don't mean to break anybody's heart. He didn't offer on the cross because you were born into a family that went to church. That has no consideration of the cross. He offered you what was on the cross because he's full of grace and loves you so much in spite of you. That's why he offered you what's on the cross. And when we live in that freedom, we get to see Christ in a whole new way. But as long as we live that I got to do to earn that, we'll never experience true freedom in Christ. Would you see the heart of the Father this morning? This morning's song is The Father's House by Corey Asbury. I want you to hear the song, the background of the song in just a second. I'm going to let them play it, but wait. The song was born probably 2.5, maybe 3 years before it was fully written. It was in the middle of a tour I was on, and my soul was just tired. This is what caught my attention, by the way. I was weary, I was feeling broken, I was jacked up, weak, messed up, all the things that we feel as humans. I just sat down at the piano, and a lot of times for me, music is therapy. It's the time where I just pour out my heart before the Lord, and all of a sudden, this one phrase came out of nowhere. You never wanted me to be perfect. You just wanted my heart. I realized in that moment that it wasn't about me having it all together. It wasn't about me keeping score and making sure my score is always under par. It was just about me offering my heart to God and letting the heart of the Father minister